Potato. What's up everyone, it's Goose, and today I won some prizes at an arcade. Today I want to make a video going over the positives of the Quad Cortex. If you've been on my channel in the past, you know I've had my critiques about this thing. And while my videos have been really specific about the things I'm not particularly happy about, a lot of folks in the comments have been considering using a Quad Cortex or getting a Quad Cortex, and I just felt like it was time for me to be more positive about it. But sometimes having critique can kind of feel a little negative, and so I wanted to be a little bit more fair because I do think this unit is worth getting. And so today's video is about why this unit is worth getting, with maybe just one caveat to set expectations or temper expectations a little bit. Because overall, it is still a good product, even if it does have some areas for improvement, but that's every other product, right? So yeah, let's talk about why this is good. Before we move on, if you like nerding out about guitar gear like me, look, you can see me in the reflection of the Quad Cortex. Consider hitting like and subscribe. All right, so let's get right into it. The first reason why you'd want to own a Quad Cortex is because you own a lot of amps. If you have an amp collection, typically there's something about each amp that you like. So for example, I really like my orange for like a punk rock tone. I like my Friedman down here for like a rock tone. And so something like the Quad Cortex that can actually capture those amps and then also be basically an all-in-one modeler with pedals, effects, and whatnot. I think this is still the only unit that has like the power to do all of that. And in my opinion, getting captures on the Quad Cortex is absolutely the way to go to get like the amp models that you want. Because while it does have some component models in here, and I've done a plethora of comparisons with the Quad Cortex amp models versus like Fractal and Helix and whatnot, I actually think the component models are a little bit more hit or miss, versus I think the captures are fairly decently good. You could definitely argue that something like the Tonex or the Neuro Amp Modeler definitely has more accurate captures, which I tend to agree, but this can fit like 4 different amps. You can do that and more in just one preset, and you can do a whole gig in that one preset with the Quad Cortex. I don't think you can do that with any other sort of modeler that also does captures. So yeah, for taking your entire amp collection, capturing that, and putting them in one preset for your performance, for live performances, the QC is the way to go, in my opinion. The next thing about the Quad Cortex that's really worth getting it for is the size to power ratio. In terms of comparable sizes, I think the HX Stomp XL, maybe also the Ampera 2 Stage, as well as the Fender Tone Master Pro. There might be a few others, but I think the Quad Cortex has the most power for this comparable size. I think a decently mid-sized board is something like 22 by 14, and this is pretty close to that. And if you take the Quad Cortex and you put it on there, you're going to still have a lot of room on it for like other pedals and power supply and whatnot. So if you want external pedals to go with your modeler, you're not gonna be able to do this with like a FM9 or like a Helix. So in terms of size to power ratio, the Quad Cortex is definitely still the king in the market, in my opinion. And if you have a beefy power supply, you can run this from that. You just have to make sure you have the appropriate outputs for it. It does require a little bit more power than your usual pedal, but you can manage that. And that's preferable because the stock power cable is absolute The third reason to consider a Quad Cortex is actually because of YouTubers. One of the biggest advantages of the Quad Cortex being the most popular modeler amongst guitarists and YouTubers and whatnot is that a lot of the YouTubers will have a lot of presets and captures available for this unit. So if there's a YouTuber that always nails the tone that you want and they make presets, you can just get that tone on this device. That does also apply to other modelers, but this one is the most popular, so you're more likely to have presets available for it from those guitarists that you really love. And personally, that was never my personal workflow because I just prefer diving into the component modeled amps. But recently I started trying some presets and captures from people like Kyle Bull or John from Sonic Drive Studios, and I think it sounds great. I really started to appreciate those captures more than the component modeled amps in the Quad Cortex, largely because I was trying those presets and captures from those YouTubers. And there's a lot of benefit to preferring the capture models because a lot of people hear their favorite tones from, let's say, an album or a YouTube video or even live shows, and they want to chase that. And so what the capture gives you is that opportunity to just get that here. An example would be that one of my favorite bands is Alice in Chains, and so when I boot up any modeler, I go straight for Friedman models because that's what Jerry Cantrell uses. But I could just as easily load a capture of someone's Friedman JJ, load it on here, and already be like 90% there without having to mess with any dials. So yeah, I think the QC's popularity among YouTubers really does work well for that kind of a flow. If you just don't want to mess with dials and you just want to load something, and that actually helps with inspiration as well. Like, you don't want to be messing with dials, you want to be playing and writing. So having those captures available is really good for that kind of a workflow. What you just heard was a capture of the new Prometheus amp by Liclairm Audio. And John from Sonic Drive Studios did the capture as well as a bunch of presets, so go check out his video if you are interested in that tone, because I think it sounds great. The fourth reason to get a Quad Cortex, in my opinion, is the touchscreen. Of all the modelers I own, this is the only one where I don't feel like I have to go to the desktop app in order to edit stuff. There's definitely something to being able to drag blocks around on the screen here that's just much more intuitive than using a bunch of poorly labeled knobs on other devices. I'm looking at you, FM9. Personally, I still prefer to use desktop editors over any of the interfaces on the modelers themselves. I prefer using Quad Cortex Control, for example, over the touchscreen on the Quad Cortex. But when you're in a live scenario and you can't just plug the USB into a computer to adjust settings, the touchscreen here is the way to go, in my opinion. It's just way more usable than stuff like the HX Stomp or the FM9. Maybe in the future I'll get a chance to check out the Headrush or the Bosch GX100 to see if their touchscreens are any better than the one here on the Quad Cortex, because there still is some latency when I'm using the touchscreen here. It's not terrible, it's still miles ahead of the other interfaces that I've had to use, but I just am curious to see how the other touchscreens are. But as it stands, this is the one that really popularized it. This is the one that made it easy to use, and it is really easy to use, especially in comparison to the other ones I mentioned earlier. The fifth and last reason why I think the Quad Cortex is worth getting in 2024 is because it can run a full band. I touched on this when I compared the FM9 with the Quad Cortex. The FM9 is the closest competitor to this in terms of power. And while I think the FM9 actually wins out in terms of having a more complex signal chain for one guitar, I think the Quad Cortex wins in terms of accommodating a full band. So while you can run multiple amps in the FM9, for example, you have to swap through them with the A, B, C, D portion of that amp block, versus you can just run a bunch of amps in this chain itself on here, and therefore it lets you run 3 simultaneous amps if you want. And this is actually a widely used scenario. I've seen at least 3 bands run their whole entire rig through this. So if you aren't picky about your own signal chain, I think this can really alleviate costs for some folks actually. Because this is $1,700, which sounds like a lot, but when you think about it, divide that for 2 guitarists and 1 bass player, and that's basically less than having 3 separate HX Stomps, for example. So looking at it that way, also the fact that you'd be using less power, less cables overall, this ends up becoming the most kind of convenient per dollar purchase for a modeler. All right, so those are 5 reasons to consider a Quad Cortex in 2024. However, I did want to add one caveat, because nothing is worse than being hyped about getting something and then being disappointed. And I'm not saying that this is a disappointing product, but I just want to add this caveat to temper expectations a little bit. If any of the 5 things I said earlier sold the Quad Cortex to you, then this next point isn't going to be a deal breaker, but it is just something that I think everyone should know. And that one caveat is you're not going to automatically sound better because you got a Quad Cortex. I know a lot of people go from like a Helix or a HX Stomp to the Quad Cortex, and their experience is that, oh, I feel like I sound better. And I'm not going to take anything away from that because that might be true. You might feel like with the features that the Quad Cortex has that you're just able to make the sound that comes to your head. And that's great. I think that's awesome. But I actually think a lot of that has more to do with the ease of use rather than the tones. For example, one of the biggest complaints that I've actually heard from people that I've talked to is that on the HX Stomp, especially on the desktop editor, they tend to use bars to represent the amount of level of the dials. And on the Quad Cortex and like the FM9, for example, we use dials, and we're so used to dials on real amps. So seeing bars might make it really hard for you to reference exactly where on the dial you want to be for a guitar amp. But when you take that out of the equation, you take the ease of use out of the equation, and you just talk about just the tones, I find that most people sound the same through this, through HX Stomp, through Helix, through Fractal. They just sound like themselves no matter what modeler they play through. But what I really want to get at is if you're getting tones you like from the HX Stomp or the Helix, you're not automatically going to sound better on this. You're going to sound exactly like you sound. And that's inherent to your play style as well as how you prefer to dial in amps. But even though this is a caveat, think about this as a positive because you're going to still sound like you, but now you have all the convenient reasons that I mentioned earlier with a device like this. And I foresee a lot of the other modelers in the future chasing after that usability, those 5 reasons why I mentioned earlier, in the next generation of modelers or so, because the Quad Cortex was so successful in implementing those. So in terms of usability also, it's going to be quite good for a long time. And in other videos, yeah, I talk about a lot of the things I wish could be improved about the Quad Cortex. But I think there's 2 reasons for that, and that's because, one, it does a little bit of everything, it just doesn't particularly focus on one thing. But also because I care. I really want this to be good. I really want it to do everything as well as everything else. And yeah, it does more things than most other modelers, but I also want it to do those things as well as the other modelers, if that makes any sense. I'm the kind of person where if I didn't care about something, I just tend to ignore it. I'd rather not mention it at all. But I care about stuff like this getting better because it can only make the entire industry of modelers better. As I always say, the diehard fans are in the best position to advocate for the things that they love getting even better than they already are. Don't ever say that I wasn't fair. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. Let me know in the comments down below if any of these reasons helped your decision on a Quad Cortex, and if the caveat, maybe you do feel like you sound better on the Quad Cortex than other modelers. You know, your opinion is just as valid as mine. I'm just one person, and so are the rest of us. That said, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the next one. Later.